She was given in sacrifice to the man everyone called the Beast, the monster who was supposed to be her ruin. But he would become the only savior capable of protecting her from the true savagery that hid in her own home. The irony of finding salvation where ruin was expected is just the beginning of this story. If you believe in the strength born from this unexpected alliance, subscribe so you don't miss the unfolding of this journey. The Chihuahua sun was merciless, baking the dust of the central square until it rose in suffocating clouds with every step. In the center of a circle of cowboys and ranchers, a man was on his knees, his wrists tied firmly behind his back. He was a Chiricahua Apache warrior, his body covered in dust and dried blood, but his dark, piercing eyes held no fear. They swept over the crowd with a defiant calm, registering every face thirsty for violence. Don Eladio Vega, the local chieftain whose wealth was as vast as his cruelty, watched with a satisfied smile, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. The crowd murmured, a rising chorus of hatred and excitement, waiting for the signal for the summary execution to turn that scorching afternoon into a spectacle of blood. The air was heavy, not just with the heat, but with the certainty of imminent death. It was then that a sound cut through the tension, the rustle of silk against the packed earth. Isadora Morales, pale as a desert flower under the moon, made her way through the armed men, her eyes fixed not on the smiling Don Eladio, but on the prisoner. A collective gasp ran through the crowd at the sight of the daughter of one of the most respected, though decadent, families in the region, advancing with a determination that belied her fragile appearance. She stopped a few feet from the warrior, her body trembling, but her voice sounding clear and surprisingly firm. "Don't touch him!" she shouted, the command echoing in the shocked silence that fell. Then, looking directly at Don Eladio, she made the declaration that would seal her fate. "I'll take him. I will pay any price you ask for his life. He is mine." Don Eladio's laughter erupted, harsh and cruel, shattering the silence like glass. The crowd, uncertain until then, followed its leader, and a chorus of scorn rippled through the square. "You'll pay?" he scoffed, approaching her, contempt evident on his face. "And with what, girl? With the dust from the lands your father already lost to gambling? Or perhaps with your honor, which seems to be of the same value?" The insult hung in the hot air, and Isadora's eyes burned with unshed tears. But she didn't retreat an inch, her body rooted to the ground like a stubborn root seeking water. Ignoring the humiliation, she kept her chin up, her posture as rigid as a statue's. "I offer what you most desire, and have never been able to buy," she said, her voice low but laden with a weight that silenced the nearest laughter. "The deed to the Hacienda Morales, the source of the Rio Serpiente, the last thing of value my family possesses." The mention of the spring made Don Eladio's smile waver. It was the only water source in the region he didn't control. Kneeling, the Apache warrior, whose name no one dared to utter, raised his gaze. He did not understand the words exchanged, the bargain of land and water, but he understood the universal language of courage. For the first time, his eyes saw not just a pale and fragile woman, but an unexpected flame burning in the middle of the desert, and his impassive expression of defiance was replaced by a shadow of bewildered curiosity. Greed shone in Don Eladio's eyes, a flame hotter than the sun itself. The spring was the key to absolute dominion over the region. He pondered for a moment, savoring the total humiliation of Isadora, the proud heiress now begging for the life of a savage. With a slow, theatrical gesture, he moved away from her and circled the Apache prisoner. "An interesting proposal," he said, his voice echoing across the silent square. "The land and the water for this dog, but there is one condition. You are not buying his freedom. You are buying his leash. He is your property, your responsibility. If he escapes, if he kills someone, the blood debt will be yours, and I will come to collect it myself." He stopped before Isadora, his face inches from hers. "Do we have a deal, Señorita Morales?" Isadora did not hesitate, her eyes meeting his without wavering. "We have a deal, Don." Eladio. With a disdainful nod, Eladio ordered one of his men, "Cut the ropes on his feet. The rest is her problem." The cowboy obeyed with a rough pull, causing the warrior to stumble. Isadora stepped forward and, ignoring the crowd's gasps of astonishment, took the end of the rope that still bound the Apache's wrists. The rough fiber scratched her soft skin, a first physical contact that sealed the bizarre pact. She said not a word, just pulled gently, a silent command. The warrior rose to his full height, imposing even in defeat, and his dark eyes locked onto hers. He saw the tremor in her hand, but also the steel resolution in her spine. Without resistance, he followed her. Together, they walked through the crowd, which parted like a dirty river, whispers following them like flies. She did not look back, not even when she felt the weight of Don Eladio's eyes on her back, a seal of ownership on the land she had just surrendered. Behind her, the Apache warrior walked in silence, his steps firm in the dust, a captive and his captor moving away from hell, only to enter another of their own making. The path to Hacienda Morales was walked in a heavy silence, broken only by the sound of their own footsteps in the dust and the distant hum of the town they left behind. Every step was a battle for Isadora, who fought against waves of dread and the crushing weight of what she had just done. The rope in her hand was both an anchor and a shackle, the only tangible link to the decision that had changed her life forever. She could feel the Apache's eyes on her back, a presence as intense as the sun on her neck, but she didn't dare look back. He followed her without resistance, his steps measured and silent, like a hunter surveying unknown terrain. When they finally reached the wrought iron gates that hung crookedly from their hinges, a symbol of her family's decay, Isadora stopped. Only then did she turn, her heart hammering against her ribs, and face the gaze of the man whose life now belonged to her. Inside the courtyard, where weeds choked the rose bushes her mother had so loved, the reality of the situation hit them with full force. The rope she held was a sham, a piece of theater for Don Eladio and the town. She had not bought him to be a slave, she had bought him to be a weapon. With trembling hands, she let go of him and entered the house, returning moments later with a small knife. He remained as still as a granite statue, watching her every move as she approached. The world seemed to hold its breath as she reached out and, with a quick, decisive cut, severed the bonds that held his wrists. He didn't move immediately, just raised his hands and rubbed the rope-marked wrists. His dark eyes, previously filled with a bewildered curiosity, now studied her with a piercing intensity, demanding an answer. "They call you a savage," Isadora whispered, her voice barely a breath in the still air. "I see the only man who can save me." Isadora's courage in turning a prisoner into her only hope is chilling. Leave your theory in the comments about what his reaction will be, and subscribe so you don't miss the unfolding of this unlikely alliance. The Apache warrior did not answer. Her words, a desperate whisper, hung and died in the heavy air between them. He remained motionless for a long moment, his dark eyes scanning her face, searching for the truth behind the courage or madness that had led her to such an act. Then, slowly, he moved his neck. The sound of cracking bones, audible in the courtyard's silence. His gaze swept over the ruined hacienda, the dry fountain, the broken windows like empty eyes. He was no longer a prisoner awaiting orders. Ignoring her completely, he walked with a silent purpose to the old stone well in the corner of the courtyard. The bucket's rope was frayed, but it held as he lowered and pulled it up with a restrained strength. Without ceremony, he plunged his entire head into the bucket of cold, murky water, emerging with a guttural sigh, water streaming through his black hair, washing the blood and dust from his face and neck. Only then, after quenching a primal thirst, did he turn to her, the defiance back in his gaze. He hadn't said a word, but the question was as clear as day. And now what? Isadora understood the language of his actions. He owed her nothing. Gratitude was a currency that had no value here. She had to give him a reason, a cause that was as much his as it was hers. Swallowing the knot of fear in her throat, she gestured with her head toward the main house and turned, trusting that he would follow. The interior of the house was a sanctuary of shadows and memories, the air thick with the smell of dust and decay. Furniture covered in white sheets looked like ghosts in mourning. She led him down a dark corridor to her mother's old room, a place she rarely entered. With trembling hands, she opened the heavy cedar chest at the foot of the bed. Inside, wrapped in silk, yellowed. By time was a wedding dress. She lifted it, the delicate lace falling in a cascade. The warrior looked at the dress, then at her, confusion etched on his features. Isadora then uttered a single name, the word leaving her lips like poison. Don Eladio. She touched the dress, then shook her head with a desperate violence, her eyes filling with a dread he understood perfectly. He didn't need to understand the word marriage. He understood the claim of ownership, the mark of an enemy on a woman's most sacred object. He looked from the dress to Isadora, and for the first time, the curiosity in his eyes gave way to a spark of grim understanding. She wasn't offering him a leash. She was showing him a common enemy. The Apache warrior looked from the dress to the knife she still held. With a slow movement that gave Isadora no time to react or feel fear, he reached out and took the small blade. It was not a gesture of threat, but of reclamation. He turned the knife in his hand, the cheap steel. Catching a sliver of light filtering through the dirty window, his experienced fingers tested the blade's edge against his thumb, a gesture of professional assessment that made her shudder. He put the dress back in the chest with a disdainful push, an act that dismissed the symbol in favor of the tool. Then his eyes left her, scanning the room, the dark corridor outside, as if measuring the weaknesses of this ruined fortress. He needed no more explanations. Her offer was not for salvation, it was for war. And he, a warrior with no tribe, no weapons and no freedom, had just been given a cause and a first weapon. The relief that flooded Isadora was so overwhelming that her legs weakened. She leaned against the chest, her heart still racing, watching him. The pact was sealed, not with words, but with the weight of that small knife in his hand. Realizing his strength had been sapped by thirst and captivity, she led him out of the dark sanctuary of the past and into the hacienda's kitchen. The place was nearly bare, but she found a piece of dry cheese, half a loaf of bread, and a pitcher of water. She placed the humble meal on the worn wooden table without a word. He watched her, then sat and ate, not with the voracity of a starving man, but with the methodical efficiency of a man refueling his body for a difficult task. The sound of bread being broken and water being swallowed was the only one in the room. The sun began to set, painting the courtyard in shades of orange and purple. They remained in that silence, a bankrupt heiress and a nameless warrior united by a common enemy. The hacienda was no longer the tomb of her hopes. It had become a fragile sanctuary, the training ground for the storm they themselves had summoned. When the last strip of daylight gave way to darkness and the silver moon rose over the crumbling walls, he stood up. The bread and water had lit a cold fire within him, and now his warrior instincts took over. He began to move through the house, not as a guest, but as a predator mapping its territory. His steps were silent on the floorboards that groaned under Isadora's. He tested the lock on each door, the firmness of each shutter. In the courtyard, he assessed the walls, the blind spots, the angles of attack from the main gate. Isadora watched him from the shadows of the kitchen, a ghost in her own home. He wasn't seeing the ruin of her family's fortune. He saw a fortress to be defended or a trap from which to escape. Near the old stable, His eyes found a rusty scythe abandoned against the adobe wall. He picked it up, the weight of the steel familiar in his hand. He spun the tool, turning it into an extension of his arm. The small knife was an insult. This was a weapon. He didn't look at her, but Isadora felt a shift in the air. The despair that had haunted those walls for years was being displaced by something older and far more dangerous. A purpose. Later, they met again in the courtyard. The night air was cool, a welcome relief after the day's heat. He was sharpening the scythe's blade on a whetstone he had found, the rhythmic, harsh sound of steel against stone, the only thing breaking the silence. Isadora approached, her heart a bird trapped in her ribs. She stopped at a safe distance. She needed him to be more than an anonymous force, more than the Apache. Gathering what courage she had left, she touched her own chest. "Isadora," she said, her voice clear in the stillness. He didn't stop his work, but his dark eyes rose to meet hers in the moonlight. She then gestured toward him, a silent question in her gaze. He continued to sharpen the blade for a long moment, the sound grating on her nerves. It seemed an eternity before he stopped. He looked at her, then at the night sky, as if consulting the stars. His voice, when it finally came, was deep and rough from disuse, like stones rolling in a dry riverbed. Chaitan, the name hung between them, a fragile bridge built over an abyss of silence and blood. She repeated it in a whisper, Chaitan, tasting the sound of the word, the sound of her only terrible hope. His name hung between them, a solid truth amidst the ruin and fear. The sound of steel on stone ceased. Chaitan lowered the scythe, its blade now dangerously sharp under the pale moonlight. The exchange of names, such a simple ritual, had fundamentally altered the atmosphere between them. He was no longer just the Apache, a force of nature she had unleashed. And she was no longer just his reluctant savior. They were two people, bound together by the hand of fate and hatred for one man. The silence that followed was no longer heavy and uncertain, but one of expectation. Isadora realized the night of planning was over. Dawn would bring the beginning of the real work, one that went far beyond simply surviving. She would need to learn to see her own home, her land, through his eyes, not as a lost inheritance, but as a battlefield full of advantages and weaknesses. She retreated inside, leaving him with the stars, feeling for the first time not just the terror of her gamble, but a spark of power. She had not bought a slave, she had forged an ally. The sun had barely crested the distant mountains when a rhythmic sound woke Isadora. Outside in the courtyard, Chaitan was moving with a hypnotic fluidity. He had found a sturdy wooden post, perhaps from an old fence, and was striking it repeatedly with the scythe, then with his hands and feet. It was not blind rage, but disciplined training, each movement precise and deadly, reacquainting his body with the language of violence. Isadora watched him from the window, fascinated and terrified. He was a weapon, sharpening itself. Later, he took her outside the hacienda walls, to the dry land she had spent her entire life ignoring. He did not speak, but he taught. He pointed to the almost invisible tracks of a rabbit, then to the heavier prints of a coyote. Then, with a finger, he traced the boot. Marks of horsemen in the dust, partially erased by the wind. They were Eladio's men from the day before. He looked at her, and his gaze said it all. The enemy has already been here. They know your terrain better than you do. That needs to change. It was Isadora's first lesson in the war she had declared. To defend her home, she first needed to know it. The days that followed transformed the land around the hacienda into the harshest of teachers, and Chaitan, the most relentless of masters. He woke her before dawn, not with words, but with a simple touch on her shoulder, and led her into the scorching desert. To Isadora, it was a hell of thorny bushes and cracked earth. To him, it was an open book. He taught her to identify the subtle shade of green on a plant that indicated underground water, forcing her to dig with her own hands until her fingers bled and she found moisture. He taught her to move in silence, to use the wind to mask her scent and the sun to blind an observer's eyes. She learned that hunger was a distraction and thirst a weakness to be controlled. Her body, accustomed to silk and shade, protested with aches and burns, but her mind sharpened. She began to see the world no longer as her lost inheritance, but as a chessboard of survival, and every rock and cactus was a potential piece. Back within the hacienda walls, the lessons shifted from survival to war. Chaitin turned the place's decay into a weapon. Under his silent guidance, Isadora helped dig shallow, pits hidden by dry leaves at the main access points. They loosened boards on the porch so they would groan under a stranger's weight and strengthened a section of the adobe wall that offered the best view of the road, creating a makeshift watchtower. He handed her the small knife and, using a piece of wood, taught her the basic movements. Where to strike to incapacitate, where to cut to kill. There was no elegance, only a brutal economy of motion. Isadora, whose hands had only known embroidery, and the keys of a piano, learned the weight of a blade. The hacienda was not being restored, it was being fortified. Each day of silent work, under each other's watchful gaze, erased a little more of the woman she had been and forged the survivor she needed to become. They were no longer captor and captive, they were the guardians of a besieged fortress, waiting for the enemy's tide to rise. The quiet was broken not by a shout, but by the distant rhythmic sound of horse hooves. It was Chaitin who heard it first. He was on the flat roof of the main house, a silhouette against the pale blue morning sky, when his entire body stiffened. Isadora, who was mending one of the water bags in the courtyard, saw the change in him, and a chill ran down her spine. He didn't look at her, just raised 2 fingers, then pointed to the road. 2 riders. Isadora dropped the bag, her heart hammering against her ribs. Fear was a bitter bile in her throat, but panic didn't paralyze her as it would have weeks before. Instead, she ran inside, grabbing the small knife from the kitchen table. She didn't go to hide. She silently climbed to the watch post they had reinforced, her heart beating in time with the approaching hooves. The dust on the horizon confirmed his signal. The tide finally was rising. They came with the arrogance of wolves approaching a lone lamb, 2 of Don Eladio's most brutal thugs. They found the main gate locked and laughed, shouting Isadora's name with crude insults, expecting her to appear in tears. But the hacienda remained silent. One of the men dismounted, walking toward the porch to break down the door. That's when Chaitin moved. He didn't climb down from the roof. He leaped onto the crumbling adobe wall, dropping into the shadows of the stable with the silence of an owl. The man on the porch never saw him coming. There was a wet, cutting sound as the scythe's blade met flesh, and the man fell without a groan. The second rider, seeing his companion collapse, drew his revolver, his eyes wide with panic and confusion. It was Isadora's moment. From her watchpost, she kicked a pile of loose tiles they had placed there for this exact purpose. The loud, sudden noise made the man turn instinctively in her direction, giving Chaitin the second he needed. He crossed the courtyard in 3 long strides, and the fight was over before it even began. The silence that followed was deeper and more terrible than any Isadora had ever known. She looked at the 2 bodies in the courtyard, the sun shining on the blood that stained the dust of her home. There was no triumph, only the harsh, cold reality of her choice. Chaitin looked at her, his face an impassive mask, but his eyes conveyed a silent acknowledgement. The first line had been drawn with the blood of Eladio's men. The silence that followed was not one of peace, but the vacuum left by violence. Chaitin didn't give Isadora time to drown in shock. He moved with brutal efficiency first, taking the revolvers and bullet belts from the bodies. He then looked at Isadora and nodded towards the fallen men. The message was clear. The work was not finished. A wave of nausea hit her. but she swallowed it, the acid burning her throat. This was the price. Together, in the fading light, they dragged the bodies into the dark, smelly stable, the dead weight a horrifying testament to their new reality. Chaitin covered them with old hay and rotten planks, not a burial, but a concealment. Back, in the courtyard, he took a bucket of water and methodically washed the dark stains from the earth, erasing the proof of their grim victory. Isadora watched, her hands trembling, feeling that each drop of water was not cleaning the dust, but drowning the woman she used to be. The night brought a chill that had nothing to do with the air temperature. They sat at the kitchen table, the two revolvers and the extra ammunition spread between them like the pieces of a deadly game. With a familiarity that spoke of a lifetime of conflict, Chaitin disassembled and cleaned the weapons, the oil and steel gleaming in the light of a single candle Isadora had lit. He reassembled one of the revolvers and, without a word, pushed it across the table toward her. The wooden grip was smooth, and the metal was heavy in her hand, a weight of purpose and consequence. She looked at the gun, then at him, and understood the silent lesson. The scythe and the knife were tools of desperate defense. This was a weapon for hunting. They hadn't just defended the fortress, they had provoked the tyrant. The next wave would not be scouts, it would be hunters. And they could no longer simply wait for death to arrive at their gate. The weight of the revolver in her hand was different from anything Isadora had ever felt. It wasn't the cold, intimate blade of a knife. It was a promise of death at a distance, impersonal and final. Chaitin watched her for a moment, then led her outside to the moonlit courtyard. He didn't use words. He took the gun from her trembling hand, opened the cylinder, showed her the brass bullets and how to load them, his movements economical and precise. He then placed the gun back in her hand, wrapping his own calloused fingers over hers, forcing her to feel the alignment of the sights, the tension of the trigger. He pointed to an old, rusty metal can on a fence post. The shot tore through the night, shockingly loud, and the gun's recoil jolted her arm up to the shoulder. The can flew off the post. She felt no triumph, only the ringing in her ears and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Chaitin took the gun, reloaded the empty chamber, and handed it back to her. The test was over. The lesson had begun. The next morning's light brought not relief, but a cold urgency. Using the dead men's horses, they now had speed and range. Don Eladio would be expecting a report from his men. When it didn't come, he would send more. Passivity was a death sentence. In the stable, as Isadora saddled one of the horses, a foreign act she learned by observation, Chaitin crouched and with a finger drew a map in the dust. They were lines and circles that meant nothing to her until he began to point and look at her for confirmation. She understood. He was mapping the terrain by instinct, and he needed names. "The Soto's ranch," she said, pointing in one direction. "The Smuggler's Trail," she said, pointing to another. "Eladio's well, where he waters his cattle." This was where her intelligence merged with his tactics. He erased the map with his foot and looked at the sun, measuring the time. By nightfall they were riding into the desert, no longer as guardians of a besieged fortress, but as hunters leaving their lair for the first time. They rode under a blanket of stars, two elongated shadows moving through the desert silence. Chaitin led, not following a trail, but reading the land with a familiarity that Isadora was beginning to envy. He stopped on a rocky crest, signaling for her to dismount and approach on her belly. Below them, in a small depression, a lone campfire glowed. 3 men stood near it, their silhouettes relaxed against the fire, guarding Don Eladio's well. A large herd of cattle moved restlessly in the surrounding darkness. Chaitin looked at the cattle, then at Isadora. He pointed to a part of the herd that was closer to the cliff, then to the revolver at her hip. The instruction needed no words. Cause a panic. He handed her the scythe, taking the small knife for himself, a gesture that indicated his work would be close and silent. Isadora's heart went cold. The weight of the revolver on her hip was a block of ice, and the task before her seemed like a chasm. The plan was brutal in its simplicity. As Chaitin disappeared into the shadows, moving like smoke toward the camp, Isadora crawled to the edge of the cliff, positioning herself above the herd. The smell of dust and cattle filled her lungs, the sound of the animals chewing, and shifting a low, constant rumble. With trembling hands, she drew the revolver. She closed her eyes, saw Don Eladio's mocking face, and fired into the sky. The shot was a thunderclap that shattered the night. The herd exploded into a chaos of bellows and thundering hooves, stampeding wildly away from the noise. At the camp, the men leaped to their feet, guns drawn, shouting in confusion toward the stampede. It was all the distraction Chaitin needed. Isadora saw only flashes of what followed. A shadow leaping from the rocks, the glint of the moon on the knife's blade, short, choked cries that were quickly swallowed by the night. When a deadly silence fell over the well, broken only by the distant sounds of the fleeing cattle, Chaitin reappeared. He was uninjured. Without a word, he dragged the men's bodies and threw them into the well, contaminating the water with death. They hadn't just killed the guards, they had poisoned the source of their enemy's wealth. The ride back was done in a silence even thicker than before. It was not the silence of uncertainty, but the heavy silence of shared knowledge. The smell of gunpowder seemed to have clung to Isadora's hands, and the memory of the panicked cattle echoed in her ears. She looked at Chaitin's back, a silhouette moving steadily ahead of her, and saw no longer a savior or a weapon, but an accomplice. The dark fruits of their night's work were with them. 3 extra rifles tied to a saddle, ammunition belts, and canteens filled. With the very water they had poisoned. For every step the horse took toward the precarious safety of the hacienda, Isadora felt herself moving further away from the woman she had been. There was no turning back now. They had not just defended themselves. They had attacked the heart of Don Eladio's power, and the roar of the wounded beast would surely be heard across the desert. When they reached the hacienda walls under the grey veil that precedes the dawn, there was no rest. Chaitin made no move to sleep. Instead, he began to move with a new, terrible urgency. He took the best supplies they had, the dried meat, the water bags, all the ammunition, and divided them into compact bundles. Isadora watched him, at first confused, until he stopped and looked at her. He pointed to the hacienda walls, then to the vast open desert, and slowly shook his head. The message was unmistakable and chilled Isadora's blood. The fortress they had built was now a trap. Eladio would not send more scouts. He would come with an army to wipe this place off the map. To survive, they needed to disappear into the only thing that could hide them. The vastness of the land that Chaitin knew like the back of his hand. Without hesitation, Isadora turned her back on the last vestige of her old life and began to help saddle the horses. The hacienda was no longer a home to be defended. It was a tomb to be abandoned. They didn't take much, just weapons, water, and the bitter determination to survive. Before mounting, Isadora paused at the crooked gates and looked back one last time. The grey light of dawn softened the house's lines, making it look less like a ruin and more like a sleeping ghost. She saw her mother's bedroom window, the porch where her father had taught her the names of the constellations, the dead rose bushes that were once the family's pride. Every brick was a memory, and now every memory was an anchor that would drown her. Chaitin watched her in silence, his face impassive, but he understood. He went into the kitchen and emerged with an oil lamp and a rag. Without a word, he offered it to her. The flame danced in her eyes as she took the makeshift torch. With steady steps, she went back inside, not to mourn, but to purify. When she came out, the smell of smoke followed her. They mounted their horses and rode away without looking back, even as the first flames licked the dry roof, sending a column of dark smoke into the sky like a funeral pyre for the world she had left. Forever. The smoke at their backs was a compass, pointing to the only possible path, forward. The desert became their world, a domain of stone and thorns, where Chaitan moved with the certainty of a spirit born of that land. He led her through dry riverbeds and narrow canyons where the rock walls would hide their tracks. The sun rose, turning the air into a furnace, but they pushed on, urgency a spur in their flanks. For Isadora, every hour was a test of the lessons she had learned. She rationed. Her water ignored the pain in her muscles and learned to read the silent language of Chaitan's gestures, a raised hand to halt, a nod toward a safer path. The power had shifted completely. There, she was the heiress. Here, she was just a survivor whose life depended on the wisdom of the man she had freed. When they finally stopped at midday in the shadow of a cliff, it was the silence that alerted them first, followed by a faint sound carried on the wind, the distant baying of Don Eladio's hunting dogs. The beast was not just wounded, it was sniffing their blood. The sound did not provoke panic in Chaitan, but a predatory stillness. His eyes scanned the terrain, not for a hiding place, but for a weapon. And the desert's weapon was its own brutality. He grabbed the reins of Isadora's horse, pulling it close. With a swift movement, he unsheathed his knife and cut the animal's throat. Isadora let out a choked cry, shock and horror paralyzing her for an instant as the animal fell. Before she could process it, Chaitan did the same to his own horse. He then pointed to a narrow fissure in the rocks, a crack in the canyon wall that barely looked wide enough for a person. The message was brutal and clear. The horses were too large a trail, too noisy. The scent of fresh blood would keep the dogs busy, confusing them and giving them a bloody reward that would delay them. With a firm hand on her back, he pushed her into the fissure, into the darkness of the rock, while behind them, the baying of the dogs grew closer, turning into a hungry frenzy. They squeezed through the tight passage, the rough stones tearing at their clothes and skin. The darkness was almost total, and the air was cold and stagnant. Isadora moved blindly, trusting only the soft sound of Chaitan's footsteps ahead and the occasional pressure of his hand to guide her. The passage led them into a labyrinth of hidden rocks and ravines, a secret world that only a man like Chaitan could navigate. They moved for hours in absolute silence, each step a pain, each breath an effort. Finally, as the light filtering from above began to fade, he led them to a small cave, hidden behind a curtain of dry vines. Inside, exhausted and dehydrated, they heard the distant sound of a hunting horn. Eladio's men were regrouping, their search frustrated by Chaitan's savage tactic. They had escaped, for now. But now they were on foot, with no provisions beyond what they could carry, and with an enemy who would not rest until their bodies were hanging under the Chihuahua sun. In the darkness of the cave, Isadora looked at Chaitan's silhouette and understood that survival would not be a single battle, but a war of hunger, thirst, and endurance fought in the depths of that unforgiving desert. The darkness in the cave was a mineral silence, broken only by their harsh, shallow breathing. The hours passed, marked not by a clock, but by the slow movement of the stars visible through the entrance. Thirst became a burning coal in Isadora's throat. Chaitan, as still as the rock itself, finally moved as the moon began to set. He took the canteens, shaking them one by one. The nearly hollow sound was a sentence. He held one out to Isadora, and in the dim light she could see it contained only one last sip. She drank it slowly, the warm water a fleeting relief that only emphasized the depth of her need. He didn't need to say anything. The brutal language of their situation was the only one that mattered. Survival had bought them one night, but thirst would come to claim the dawn. He looked out at the lightening sky, and then at her. It was time to move or die there. Isadora nodded, a silent accomplice in the war against the desert. They left the cave into the freezing cloak of the pre-dawn night, moving not down toward the canyon, but up, scaling the rocks with painful slowness. When the sun rose, turning the sky into a white, incandescent enemy, they were on higher ground. a labyrinth of stones and desiccated cacti. Isadora's training became instinct. She watched where she stepped, moved when Chaitin moved, stopped when he stopped. It was he who found at the bottom of a dry riverbed what he was looking for, a cluster of bushes whose leaves, though dry, had a slightly deeper shade of green at the base. A muscle memory from the lesson he had taught her made Isadora take out the knife. Together, they dug into the sand and loose stone, their hands soon raw. For over an hour, they worked under the merciless sun until the sand became damp, then dark, and then a trickle of muddy water began to seep out, a dirty, precious miracle. They drank directly from the earth, the water tasting of dust and life, and for the first time in days, their eyes met, not with fear or urgency, but with the grim acknowledgement that they had bought themselves one more day. The dirty water brought them no joy, but the cold clarity of survival. Sitting by the edge of the damp hole, exhaustion weighed on them like a physical cloak. It was Isadora who broke the silence, her voice hoarse from thirst and disuse. "He won't stop," she said, looking at the empty horizon. "He'll turn over every stone in this desert, but his strength isn't in the land. It's in the men who fear him and the money he pays." Chaitin remained silent, his eyes half closed against the glare, listening. "Ricardo Vargas," she continued, the name sounding strange in the wilderness. "He has a ranch in the mountains to the south. Don Eladio stole most of his lands, but Vargas still has loyal men and knows the secret mountain passes better than anyone. He hates Eladio more than we do." She looked at Chaitin, the dust and sweat streaking her face, transforming it into a mask of determination. "We can't win by running. We need allies." Chaitin considered her words for a long moment. He looked at her hands, bruised from digging, and then at her eyes, where the fire of vengeance burned brighter than fear. He did not answer with words. He stood up, studied the sun's position, and then began to walk in a new direction, south, toward the distant mountains that rose like purple teeth against the sky. It was his acceptance. Their partnership had changed. He was the master of the desert, the key to their survival, but she was the key to the war. Isadora stood up and followed him, each painful step an act of faith in their new, terrible plan. They were no longer moving to flee death, but to court it on their own terms, marching toward an alliance forged in hatred and loss. The march south was a silent ordeal, a pilgrimage through a purgatory of rock and sun. Chaitin moved with an economy of effort that bordered on the supernatural, reading the ripples of the land as a sailor reads the sea. Isadora followed him, every step a scream from her muscles, her body a map of aches and scratches. The desert, which had been her teacher, was now her judge. There were no more lessons, only the final test. When she stumbled, exhaustion nearly overcoming her, he stopped, not to help her, but to wait for her to get up on her own. It was a gesture of respect deeper than any word of comfort. It was then, as she stood panting, that she saw a familiar rock formation on the distant horizon. "The Devil's Table," she whispered. "The ranch is a day's walk on the other side." Chaitin looked at the formation, then at her, and a brief nod sealed the information. Her knowledge now guided his endurance. Ricardo. Vargas's ranch was not a hacienda, but a fortress nestled in a small mountain valley, visible only from certain angles. Chaitin stopped them at a safe distance, watching the lookouts positioned on the rocks above. Approaching openly would be suicide. They waited for dusk, moving through the shadows to a goat trail that Isadora remembered from her childhood. They had barely gone 100 yards when the metallic click of a rifle being cocked echoed in the rocks. "Stop where you are." Two figures emerged from the shadows, the barrels of their guns held steady. Their eyes widened at the sight of Chaitin, mistrust turning to open hostility. "An Apache!" one of them spat. Before Chaitin could react, Isadora stepped forward, placing herself between him and the rifles, her hands raised in a gesture of peace. "My name is Isadora Morales," she said, her voice steady despite her fear. "We've come to see Senor Vargas. We have a common enemy, and we have brought his wrath to your door." The name Morales made the older man hesitate, the barrel of his rifle lowering an inch. The hostility in his eyes was briefly replaced by a confused curiosity. "Don Alejandro's daughter?" he asked, his voice rough. Isadora nodded, her chin held high. "Don Eladio burned my home and is hunting us like animals. He has left a trail of blood to your door. I know he has taken much from you as well." The second guard kept his gun aimed firmly at Chaitin, who remained motionless, a granite statue ready to explode. After a tense exchange of glances, the older man gave the order, "Leave your weapons on the ground, slowly." Chaitin and Isadora complied, placing their rifles and revolvers in the dust. They were led down a winding path, past more armed men who emerged from the shadows, their faces hard and suspicious, to the heart of the stone and wood fortress. Ricardo Vargas was waiting for them on the porch of a solid, unadorned adobe house, the smoke from a cigar curling slowly around him. He was a man with broad shoulders and a face weathered by time and bitterness, his eyes fixed on them like chips of obsidian. His gaze passed over Isadora with a flicker of recognition, but lingered on Chaitin with a hardened contempt, his hand resting near the holster at his hip. "The last rose of the Morales and a Chiricahua dog," he said, his voice a gravelly rumble. "If this is a joke, it's not funny. What do you want?" Ignoring the insult, Isadora stepped forward, her exhaustion vanishing under a layer of steel. "We want what you want, Senor Vargas. We want Don Eladio's head. We have wounded him. We have made him bleed. Now, with your help, we are going to kill him." Isadora's audacity, offering war instead of begging for refuge, is proof of her final transformation. Leave a comment if you believe hatred for a common enemy can unite these two men, and subscribe so you don't miss Vargas's response. Thank you all for your company.